So when the box comes, it's organized in layers. And the top layer has some books. And these are Abenaki stories that were compiled by Joe Bruchak. It has a coloring book, which is awesome because it's a coloring book that utilizes 4 of the local languages, all of which are Algonquian-based. Penobscot is one of them, which is actually Eastern Abenaki, but they're all languages that are strongly related. The coloring book can be copied, and you can use it as either language, to generate an interest in language, or just for fun. In the back of the book, it has some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful activities and some cooking stuff and some ethnobotany materials related to the plants. And these activities are all things that you can do. Things as simple as observation, observing, thinking about how you see things and how you explain how you see things, because that's important. So the purpose of white gloves for any museum or any organization that has artifacts, that has things that are old, is to help protect those things. So when you handle artifacts, you want to use those gloves so that you're not inflicting any damage, so that the oils in your skin aren't getting on it, so that the materials themselves are protected as much as possible. And finally, there's a pattern in here for an activity where you're going to make the basket. And this is a lot of fun. The kids love doing it. So that's in the top. That's the first thing you see when you open the box. The next thing you see when you open the box, and these are a variety of materials, a lot of which are handmade. So you have fur, samples of fur. You have beaver. And beaver was very prized because it has 2 layers of fur. It has this long, very warm top layer, but then it has this bottom layer that was prized by the Europeans because they made hats out of it. This bottom layer, and when you look closely at this sample, you'll be able to clearly see the difference. Mink. So as today, as almost everywhere, it's beautifully soft and it's very warm. This is a quill work basket. Now, prior to contact with the Europeans, this was the material that we used, porcupine quills, for decorative material. So this basket is made from birch bark. And you can see on the inside, you can see how it's put together. Because the way it was decorated was they took porcupine quills. And any of you who have ever touched porcupine quills stick, and they tend to work their way into your skin. They're really very nasty. So the way they would harvest these was they would harvest them carefully by not touching the end that would embed itself. And then they would clip that end. So in the bottom box is a sample of porcupine quills and the way they're processed. Now, what Native people would do is they'd clip off the part that really would dig into your skin, and then the women would chew them to flatten them so they could sew with them. So what you see here is sewn into a layer of birch. So they put a double layer so that the ends of the porcupine quills didn't stick out. This is actually a pretty old basket. You can tell it's kind of beat up. It's a little banged up, but it's probably as old as I am, which is old. A plain ash basket. These would have been made for a very long time. Ash is a really cool material. We use black ash, or what they call swamp ash, to make baskets with. And one of the reasons we use this material is because this is one of the few trees that if you pound it, you can actually squash the spring growth. It breaks. And then you can peel all the summer growths apart and get thin layers. Now, when you do that, it's not this thin and it's not this beautiful. You have to process it, and that requires some work. People would scrape it and they would layer it. You split a layer, you take a layer and you split it and you pull it apart the long way. So people pound ash, the men would pound the ash with the whole length, and they would use sledgehammers or the end of axes to pound it, to break apart to break down that spring growth. And so then they could pull strips of the summer growth. So if you had a log this long, you could get strips this long of basket making material. Then they had special tools that they made. After the Europeans came, they made points with the insides of watches because that steel was very high quality. But obviously before that, they would use things like probably stone, really thin stone, where they could make a gauge that looked kind of like this, and you would get consistent sizes of the strips to be able to make a basket that had consistent sizes. So that's kind of a cool thing. The birch basket, this is a little bit of quill work, and these are dyed with natural materials. So just a little bit of decorative material. One of the proofs that we had some leisure time, because people with no leisure time don't make decorative materials. Sinew, now this is artificial, but sinew was used frequently. It was a natural material. You got it when you killed a deer or any other type of animal. And it was really useful to sew things together with. So sinew was important. And then, of course, leathers, moose and deer. Now, my mother used to say, every animal has got enough brains to tan its own hide because you use the brains to tan the hide. So in the very bottom of the Wonderbox is this fabulous box that has sections in it, and it has all the small materials. Now, a bone that was carved into a comb, because we didn't have brushes like everybody does. So the comb could be used to either comb your hair or to hold stuff in place. And you can see there were actually 4 teeth on it. We used bone for needles too, to sew hide, to sew things together. And you can see they're big, they're kind of clumsy, but we didn't have plastic. We didn't have materials like that you could make into really pointy, fine things. There are other materials in here. There is some arrowheads. Some of you may really luck out, and somewhere along the line you might find 1 or 2. You can find them in fields sometimes. It's pretty awesome. And they're made of different materials. When you see an arrowhead like this, that's made of obsidian or Apache tears, that was traded. We don't find that around here. You know, people think that everybody was totally primitive and they were all totally isolated. No, there was trade back and forth across the country. There are stories that are told that are universal among all Native American people. And what changes is the environment or, you know, what they're crossing or whatever. But the fundamental story is the same. And so that's more proof of all those interactions. Obsidian doesn't come from here. So if somebody had an obsidian point, they traded it. Another thing that you'll see here in New England is you'll see turquoise and stones like that absolutely come from the West. They don't come from here. And so more evidence of trade. For decoration, they used cordage and decorative stones, or they used leather, again with decorative stones. So pretty stones that they would drill holes in. You know, I always like to talk about the fact that, you know, everybody talks about how Manhattan was sold for $24 worth of beads. And I want you to think about this. So Europeans had glass and they had manufacturing facilities to make beads. Native American people in this country before the Europeans came, the only way that beads were made was to take a stone or a shell and you had to grind it. And you had to grind it for a very long time and very carefully, because if you weren't really careful, it broke. And if it broke, you had to start again. So when you hear about things like wampum, which was used almost as money for many people, you have to recognize that that was incredibly labor intensive and represented hours and hours of people's effort. And that has value. So, you know, nowadays, $24 is not a whole lot of money. But back in those days, it was a huge amount of money, not to mention the fact that to the native people, that $24 worth of beads represented probably, you know, a year's worth of effort for a person. So that was a whole lot more than what you think of when you think of $24 worth of beads. That story always kind of annoys me because of that. Here's another item. It's a leather pouch. Medicine bags were very common. We wore them. My mother used to say that they carried bits of our soul. I have a medicine bag, and in my medicine bag are pieces of my mother's and my daughter's and my husband's and now my grandchildren's hair, and stones from places that have been very, very important to me, along with sacred herbs, tobacco and sage and cedar and sweetgrass. Because we use stones for a variety of things. I mean, we use stones like mortar and pestles, and this could have been an axe head, you know. I mean, sometimes you can find things like this, and it's clear that it had a purpose. So it's really very cool if you were to find something like that. More beads, but these are beads made of shell or wood, and that was very common. And again, very decorative. More wooden beads. And here is a birch bark. Now this was designed to be a hair clip. Obviously, it wouldn't have been made like this in those days. But it shows you how people use quill for decoration. And they did make hair clips. They just didn't have little metal pieces on the back like ours do. But they made hair things. They made designs. They're called roaches, and they are often made of deer and with different kinds of beads on them. Fish hooks. Again, something very cleverly made of bone. So one of the things that you have here is up in Surrey, in the river, there is what was a fish weir, they call them. And what that was a way to push the fish into one spot so they could be harvested. And these are fish hooks carved of bone, which is pretty amazing. Tools made of stone. When you flint some of this material, you can get very sharp edges. Obsidian particularly will give you tremendously sharp edges. As a matter of fact, a modern use for obsidian is they make scalpels out of it to help cut into people as they're operating on them. You can make very, very sharp tools out of that. In the second box, we have some examples of materials, but also some more artifacts. We have fire maker, which, every time somebody looks at it, they go, oh, it's a bow. No, it's not. It was part of the tool to make fire with. And here are the other parts of it. You would use like pine needles or very fine material that would catch fire easily. And you would use this piece to wrap around that piece of wood to move back and forth so that it would very quickly move around in this notch, in this hole in the wood. And eventually, if you could get it going fast enough and do it right, you would get sparks, and those sparks would light like the dried leaves or the pine needles, the tinder. So it was a fire-making tool. Here is another basket. This is made from pine bark. The material that sews it together is actually spruce root. So spruce trees have very fine, long, very strong roots. And we would harvest them so that we could sew the baskets together. That pattern that I showed you earlier is to make a basket like this. Very cool. We use them for berries. So here's an interesting piece of information. When you see Native American baskets from this area that are made with birch, the white part is on the inside. Look for that, because what we learned that the white part of the bark has an antifungal material, some sort of chemical in it that prevents funguses from growing. So if you went berry picking and you put berries in a basket like this, they wouldn't mold. What happens to your berries when you stick them in your refrigerator? They mold, and they mold quickly. They wouldn't mold in here. Antifungal. So an example of birch bark, a piece of birch bark that you can, look at and see. And sweetgrass. And you should smell it. And if it doesn't smell strong enough, you can dampen it a little bit, and you can smell the sweetgrass. It's amazing. I have baskets that my great-grandmother made that are over 100 years old. And if you get them just a tiny bit damp, you can still smell the sweetgrass 100 years later. And finally, bone. Moose, but we used all kinds of bone. So the idea was that anything that you used, anything that you took from nature, you used it all. You didn't just use a piece of it and then throw the rest away. We didn't just take the horns, stick them on the wall and look at them. We used them. We used all of it. That's part of the concept of living in balance with your environment. And we were pretty good at that. So this is all material that in one form or another you would have seen before the Europeans came.